Back in part 1, we took a look at a great mix of software to see how it fared between its original arcade version and the Saturn home conversion. The 32-bit generation really was the first time these games came home virtually indistinguishable from one another. Even when there was a power gulf between hardware technologies, the games still managed to feel impressively similar. For part 2 here, I have again put together a list of games that began life as arcade releases, before being brought home to the Sega Saturn. We have a couple of hand-drawn 2D fighters from Capcom and SNK, a 3D polygonal gun game, a 2-dimensional horizontal shoot-'em-up, a hectic sprite scaler shooter similar to Sega's efforts, a digitized 2D fighter, a 3D polygon fighter, and finally a 2-dimensional action game with lots of animation. I really tried to get us a solid mix of technologies to see how different developers fared dealing with the Saturn's complicated architecture. Sometimes the results were quite impressive, and sometimes problems would keep the projects from their full potential. We've got a lot to go over, so let's get started. When the King of Fighters 95 hit the Neo Geo in July of 1995, it came in at a whopping 250 megabits and was loaded with animation on a scale rarely seen in the games before it. The backgrounds were gorgeous, the fighters so varied and distinct, it really was something to see. When the Saturn port came home in March of 1996, SNK decided to add a ROM cartridge to help the Saturn out. And help out it did, because side by side, these two are incredibly similar. The fighters keep their mini animation frames, and even the backgrounds come through with the same striking detail. The Saturn being a CD-ROM based system, of course, means that you get some load times in areas the arcade version didn't, but otherwise, the graphics and sound are impressively represented here. Even the smallest and largest of details are lovingly recreated for Saturn fans to enjoy. There's always small differences here and there that you can nitpick, but I think the majority of you will come away loving this version of the game. It absolutely spanked the PlayStation release and gave the Neo Geo CD a run for its money, and as a Saturn fan, that's pretty much all you could have asked for. Remember, this game's ROM cartridge is specific to this release and will not work with any other title, nor will standard RAM expansion upgrades work with it. Surprisingly, this was released in Europe, the only game of its type to make its way west. Our next game was chosen because it's a fine example of how difficult it was for programmers to move games from vastly different hardware platforms. In 1995, Konami released Crypt Killer in arcades across the globe. It was a light gun shooter that used shotguns that you had to pump to reload. Originally designed on the PlayStation-based GQ system, it was a fairly solid experience, if a tad bit ugly. Since the Konami GQ system had quite a bit more RAM than the Saturn, getting an accurate port was gonna be tough. Saturn textures tended to look quite a bit different from what we saw on the PlayStation, but here, they seem to not even try. Pixelation dominates the presentation top to bottom. Because the engine used 2D sprites for its enemies, that means pretty much everything is just a mess of pixels. The sad part is that it's a great two-player game and it can be a blast, particularly if you were sporting two Virtua guns. There's also mouse and analog support should you need it. The multipath gameplay and different endings can make it worth a play, but as far as conversions go, it's one of the ugliest Saturn games you're ever gonna see.
Look right!
In late 1994, Taito released Darius Gaiden on its F3 arcade system, a horizontally scrolling shoot-'em-up that had some really impressive visuals and an outstanding soundtrack. I was always impressed with this because so many of the effects come off as polygonal in nature, but nope, everything you see here is 2D. Killer line scrolling, loads of animation, and transparencies on a level that made most arcade games envious. When AI System Tokyo bought it to the Saturn, they did a bang-up job. All those impressive two-dimensional effects came along, even the transparencies, in what was a near one-to-one conversion. Like the original, you also got two-player support, multipath gameplay, and massive boss battles to tie it all together. Not to be outdone, the quality soundtrack comes along for the ride, in what is one of the most complete shooters on the platform. Like a lot of these games, most of the differences boil down to some resolution discrepancies, but most folks are going to appreciate the bigger picture of just how close everything else appears. The Saturn often excelled at two-dimensional arcade conversions, and this certainly benefited from the power it had. No corners cut here. This was a fantastic game in the arcade, and the Saturn release captures that same magic at home. Another Taito F3 system release, Elevator Action Returns, came to us in 1994 as a sequel to the original arcade classic. It expands on that formula quite a bit, now with much bigger stages, far more enemies, and a much more impressive graphics engine. Like the previous Taito release, the 1997 Saturn port was nothing short of extraordinary. All of the great animation is here, as are the scaling effects, giant explosions, and tons of enemies. The gameplay is accurate as well, with no slowdown or hiccups to ruin the pace of the action. The Saturn release was the only version you could play at home at the time, adding some exclusivity appeal to what many of you may have missed back then. You have multiple characters to choose from with different stats and different kinds of weapons to employ. Add in a second player and you have one of the most enjoyable co-op action titles of its type. I can't stress enough just how well this turned out, and highly recommend you give it a look if you've never played it before. When it comes to arcade perfection, this one sits atop the throne as one of the best. The Sega Model II arcade board was home to many great polygon games. Among those was the 1995 AM2 classic, Fighting Vipers. It played a bit like Virtua Fighter but was flashier with breakable armor and caged-in arenas. The Saturn port needed to be cut back heavily to mimic similar results. While we did get the walls around the ring, we completely lost the 3D backgrounds from there. They have now been reduced to two-dimensional images that scale and move to simulate the same level of detail. The fighters also needed to undergo quite a bit of simplification with lower polygon models, and the lighting system takes a major hit as well. Add in some resolution differences and the Saturn version is a notably downgraded experience visually. On the positive side, it still runs smoothly and the gameplay is spot on, making it very much worth a look. I always loved the high-res look of Virtua Fighter 2 on the Saturn, so the missing 3D backgrounds were a little less disappointing. Fighting Vipers lacks that same look, instead trading the ultra-sharp textures for its new lighting engine. I'm not sure that was the best way to go because it holds up much less impressively overall, at least to me. I still consider it a must-play and a damn fine 3D fighter, but caught between the technically impressive Virtua Fighter 2 and Last Bronx, it definitely plays second fiddle.
Round 1. Let the action begin. Go! Go!
When Midway released Mortal Kombat II in April of 1993, it was an instant arcade hit. Continuing the blood and gore from the first, we got improved gameplay, more fighters, and better ways to kill your friends. It received a number of home ports in the years after, but it was the 1996 Saturn edition that held the most promise. Surely this 1993 arcade game could be easily replicated on the 2D beast from Sega, right? Well, yes and no. When directly compared, the Saturn does a very fine job replicating the visuals and animation of the arcade smash hit. Sprites are large and the backgrounds are just as colorful. Stage by stage, fighter by fighter, the Saturn release really does hold up quite well from a graphical standpoint. The problems mainly occur with the sound. Once again, Acclaim sacrifices sound effects, leading to things like the announcer being cut back big time. That wasn't all. For some reason, many of the sound effects were completely replaced by inferior samples. The fatalities are plagued by poor screams that are the same for both male and female fighters. Acclaim also chose to alter the AI in this port, leading to gameplay that is quite different in feel from the arcade. You adjust to it, but it's an odd change that was completely unnecessary. In the end, what should have been arcade perfection ends up being just another port with loads of compromises. Some love it, but it should have been so much better.
Scorpion wins. Fatality. Get over here! Fatality.
Way back in October of 1989, Taito released Night Striker for its Z System arcade board. It was what you'd imagine Space Harrier would have been if you were in a car instead of a little dude attached to a rocket. The futuristic cityscapes whizzed by super fast, and there were always loads of stuff on the screen. It was simple, but the on-rail shooter action was still really fun. The Saturn port wouldn't come along until June of 1996 thanks to Ving. They had a small developer called Fill-In Cafe handle the port, the same folks that did Asuka 120%. And a bang-up job they did. The scaling here is pretty much spot on. It's smooth, the colors are accurate, and I don't think I've ever seen it slow down once. Better still, the Saturn version includes a remixed mode that had half a dozen exclusive levels not seen in any other version of the game. The truly sad part is that this really showed how well the Saturn could handle these games. With a decent developer behind it, there was no reason we shouldn't have had many more games of its type. Sega itself had a ton of titles that used the tech that would have made great additions to the library. Many of them looked just as good or better than the Polygon games of the era. Unfortunately, Night Striker S never left Japan for the Saturn, but it is in English if you want to give it a go. Our last title was released in April of 1995 in arcades by Capcom. This CPS2 game featured towering mechs battling to the death in one-on-one combat. Using the setup that had made Street Fighter II a worldwide success, this actually was quite a good game. It had a simplified button interface that was composed of 2 attacks, a weapon, and a boost. Each pilot can also choose different mechs to fight in when you begin. When it hit the Saturn in March of 1997, you could play it with or without the 1MB extended RAM cartridge. Even without it though, the port was excellent. The huge colorful sprites from the arcade are here, as are most of the interactive backgrounds. Side by side, you see that most of the incredible animation remains intact, even more so when you lock in the RAM cartridge. I always appreciated this because it felt so different from the other games Capcom released. The pacing, the techniques, the ability to disarm your foe, it made for a great time away from the familiar fireballs and uppercuts. A lot of the critiques back then actually bashed it for either being two-dimensional or being so different from what they understood. I say play the game for yourself and see. It was the first of Capcom's games to use the RAM cartridge, and just a glimpse of the glory they had in store for us. So then, we once again see the Saturn doing a mostly bang-up job with the arcade titles it received. While not every single one of them was a home run, it got far more right than it got wrong. Really, the only time you saw great compromise was when the game came from some bleeding-edge arcade technology like the Model 2, or was done by some crappy developer like Acclaim. When there was effort, there was reward. When it came to two-dimensional visuals, the Saturn could hang with the best of them, and we really only saw mild cutbacks due to memory constraints that had nothing to do with the power of the hardware itself. It really makes you appreciate all of these fine conversions, particularly the ones that would have been butchered on 16-bit consoles had they been done there. The best part though, was that the Saturn versions played every bit as good in many cases. None of these games had any game-breaking slowdown to speak of, and remain a great way to experience them to this very day. In some cases, the Japanese versions remain quite affordable, so if you're willing to go down that rabbit hole, many a great game awaits you. History has a way of belittling the Saturn's legacy with tales of bad PlayStation ports and butchered multi-platform releases, but all it takes is a little effort to see that there was so very much more that didn't fall into those categories. Between its exclusives from Sega, its solid arcade lineup, and the better third-party releases, the Saturn was one hell of a machine, well worth your time. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.